Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in our series on the history of revolutionary ideas, I'm talking to the historian of religion, Alec Ryrie, about Martin Luther, one of the most consequential figures in the whole of European history, but also, in many ways, a very unlikely revolutionary. What was the nature of the transformation that Luther's Reformation unleashed? And was he really in control of any of it? Maybe we should start, Alec, with, I guess it's the big question. This is a series about revolutionary ideas, and it's what kind of revolutionary, if at all, we should think of Luther as. And particularly if we think of the man and his origin story and the beginning of his emergence in history, the notorious, probably apocryphal story that many people will know, that in 1517 he nailed to the door of a church in Wittenberg his 95 theses complaining about the Catholic Church's practice of selling indulgences, buying people out of purgatory. That man, whether he did or didn't perform that act, didn't think of himself as a revolutionary. I think that's fair to say. So who and what was he when he emerges into history? We're going to have to work out how we get from that person to the person who upended pretty much everything.
Well, at the point when he suddenly becomes a public figure at the end of 1517, and as you say, the nailing to the door most likely didn't happen. What he did was send these theses to the printer. So this, what could have been simply a quiet academic protest, is turned into a public matter. At this point, he's professor at a newish university in Eastern Germany, and he's a member of the Augustinian order. So he's not a nobody, but he's a relatively obscure figure. And he sees himself as having a religious responsibility that arises out of that role. If there's a language that he would have used to describe what he's doing, apart from simply preaching the gospel, which I think is going to be his fundamental category, it's the term that traditionally gets attached to what he does of reform. It's a century or more later before the events that he triggers start to be called the Reformation, rather than simply one of many processes of reformation, which is a very traditional category within the Christian church at this point. And I think the difference between Reformation and the more modern category of revolution is worth dwelling on. This is a backward-looking category. It's radical in that traditionalist sense of going back to the root. So it's very much linked to that humanist sense of ad fontes, going back to the origins, clearing away accretions and corruptions. But it has something fundamentally conservative about it. The truth to which you're trying to return lies in the past. So it lacks that forward-looking quality that we in the modern age associate with revolution, even though in retrospect it looks to us like he stands absolutely on the cusp between that backward-looking and forward-looking variety of change.
And it's interesting because the word reform has also come to be associated with progressive politics. So we tend to think of reform as a forward-looking act. But as you say, and I'm going to ask you in a second about the relationship to humanism, because we've just talked about that, but it also connects to that early modern medieval idea of revolution itself. And we've talked about this as well a bit on this series, which is if the revolution is the turning of the wheel, one way to think about it is that the wheel has already turned and you've got to turn it either back or all the way round again so that you get back to the beginning. So with Luther, if to start with at least, he might think of himself as a revolutionary in that sense, which is absolutely not the modern conception. What was the thing that he thought needed turning back to? So it is the Bible and it is the truth contained in that text. But what is the origin point for him to which all of this is turning back?
The origin point that he's trying to recover is the earliest church. It's the church of the first century, and it's particularly the church of St. Paul. Luther is this very biblical figure, but he is quite picky about his use of the Bible. He's unabashed about his favoritism. There are bits of the biblical text which absolutely come alive for him and which for him allow him to redefine all the others. So this is profoundly Pauline. Paul viewed through the lens of St. Augustine of Hippo, although Luther has this sort of slightly tetchy relationship with Augustine. He believes that he has rediscovered the true, the profound, the most radical meaning of Paul's theology, and that successive layers of error have been built up on that by various corrupt Christian theologians, especially over the previous millennium, since the age of Constantine. And so it is a process of reformation, of clearing away these accretions to go back to that, for him, just shimmering, intoxicating central truth, which once he has grasped it, and we really don't know whether that's a single moment of insight, the tower experience that he sometimes talked of, or whether it's, as I think seems more likely, a slow process of awakening to it. But once he has grasped it, this is an idea which absolutely has him and is one of those knots of insight that defines the whole of the rest of the way he sees the world. It's a package of ideas that, once you've got your head around it, seems self-evidently true. I think it bears comparison to Marxism or Darwinism for having that kind of comprehensive ability to explain the world.
And we're going to talk about what those ideas were, but I just want to go back to that question about the relationship to humanism, because it is really interesting. So one of the things that you described there is a classic humanist response, which is there was a text and there were a set of practices that have been corrupted by all of the accretions that people who didn't really understand them and had other purposes, including nefarious purposes, have overlain in the way that humanists wanted to strip out what they saw as sort of scholastic interference in texts that could be recovered in their original form. But it's not humanist then to be picky about the text and sort of say, but actually I'm going to make this text the thing that I want it to be. I'm not going to do it like a historian. I'm going to say this belongs in the Bible and this doesn't belong in the Bible. And then it's also not particularly humanist to do it from an Augustinian perspective and found it on the idea that humans are fallen, sinful, hopeless creatures that need rescuing by a force outside themselves, which is God. So he kind of both does and doesn't sound like a humanist. In some ways, he sounds like an anti-humanist. In other ways, he sounds like someone who could only have emerged in an era where humanism has reformulated how people relate to the past.
I think this is one of the reasons why he's so confusing to his contemporaries, because he, as you say, he exactly spans this division. He's using humanist methods, but to very unhumanist ends. And once he's reached this profound insight, as it seems to him, about the authentic meaning of Scripture, for him that then becomes a universal solvent that dissolves everything that it comes into contact with. So, I mean, the relationship between him and Erasmus of Rotterdam, the greatest of the Christian humanists, the great intellectual celebrity of the age, to begin with, they are widely taken to be kindred spirits. Erasmus himself reports with some disgust the claim that people are saying about him that he, Erasmus, had laid the egg and Luther had hatched it. And Erasmus vigorously denies that this is the case. And you can see why they could be mistaken for allies, because many of the reforms that they are advocating are similar. They both want to clear away accretions and superstitions and empty rituals. They want to simplify the Christian life. But for Erasmus, this is in pursuit of a moral vision. He wants to return to simple Christ-like living. He's a kind of anti-theologian. He doesn't believe in complicating Christianity with these concepts. He insists that true theology is something that can be practiced by every believer. It doesn't require learning. It's simply a matter of living a Christ-like life. And for Luther, this is a grotesque misunderstanding of the human predicament. It implies that it's Pelagian, that it's possible to attain perfection by your own efforts. And so the profound falling out that Luther and Erasmus eventually have, and it takes a little while before this really comes to a head, is exactly over this question of anthropology, of what is the human condition. And Luther's profound pessimism about this, his conviction that the human predicament is unredeemable except by the grace of God, is one which bumps up against Erasmus's measured but real optimism about what it's possible for humanity to be. And this is why, for all his apparent sympathy with many aspects of Luther's movement. Erasmus goes to his death a faithful communicant Catholic.
On that question of Luther's deep pessimism about the human, which is not a humanist idea, and yet there is something that comes out of what Luther is doing, which is, I know this is a completely anachronistic term, but it is a kind of liberation theology, isn't it? It does liberate human beings from a whole host of human-made institutions and errors and accretions that hold them back, which is empowering for individuals, at least potentially empowering for individuals, at the same time that Luther has told these individuals that they are effectively powerless in the absence of a force over which they had no control. And I mean, I find this quite hard to square as well, because there are two things going on here at the same time, pulling in different directions, each of them essential to this movement, but it's quite hard to see how they hold together.
So I think the way to resolve this is there are two different layers at work here. There's what Luther himself experiences and what he believes is happening, and then there's the actual consequence of the movement that he sets loose, which some of his contemporaries are pointing out these are the things that are going to happen. So for him, his movement is profoundly liberating. This concept of freedom is right at the heart of what he is preaching. His view of the human condition is that we are enslaved. We are enslaved to sin. And the corruption and error of medieval Christianity has only redoubled that slavery. If we are imprisoned within our sins, then the church has simply been serving as the guards and exploiting our slavery to extract labor and wealth from us. And the true liberation that we can find is the spiritual liberation which Christ offers and which he himself has encountered. And it's clear when he talks about this that it has been a rapturous and overwhelming experience for him, the sense of a burden lifted, the discovery that he does not need to be responsible for pursuing his own perfection, for attaining a freedom which he knows by bitter experience he doesn't have it within his power to create for himself. And it's simply given to him as a gift. All he needs to do is to have the faith with which to receive it. And so I think possibly his most attractive book, The Liberty of a Christian, lays out what this means and the paradoxes of it. He's such a theologian of paradox. So he will say that yet true service, true Christian service, lies in discovering your freedom and then freely using it in the service of God and of all others, choosing in a Christ-like way to put oneself last and to submit to discipline and ultimately to suffering, to the life of the cross, but doing so freely rather than being compelled. So, I mean, hence his famous line that the Christian is at the same time both the sovereign Lord of all and the freest person and subject to all and the most humble slave. And he finds tremendous spiritual power in that realization of his status and of what the human condition can be. And he mixes this with talk about the freedom of the individual before Scripture. And these are the grounds on which he defies the authority of church and state. I'm sure we'll come back to this in a few minutes. And uses remarkably, in modern terms, liberal language to describe those freedoms and his rejection of external powers. And this is what's led to him being taken in modernity as this avatar of individualism and of liberalism, of the sovereign conscience and so forth, which obviously in one sense is nonsense. He is not a creator of modern relativism and plurality. And yet you don't need to distort his texts in order to get those meanings out of them. He doesn't mean the implications which they have. He's not wanting to create a society in which everybody is pursuing their own conscience in their own different ways. He wants to create a church in which true Christians are all pursuing the same truth which he has preached to them and are free to do so. And when instead his movement sets loose a cacophony of different views, he's horrified by this. And in later life will work very hard to try to close that down. That doesn't change the fact that his principles really have set some of this in motion. The fact that he doesn't like what he's done doesn't change the fact that he really has done it. So the liberty that he unwittingly sets loose is not really the liberty that he wanted. I don't think that changes the fact that he did it.
And is there a point in his story where we can say he crossed a kind of Rubicon? And to start with, as you were saying, people might think he and Erasmus were doing the same thing, and therefore that this could somehow be contained within a reformed version of the church, the Catholic Church, with the Pope at its head. Is there a point in his story, and is it early in the story, at which he would have been aware and the people around him would have been aware that that's no longer possible, that this thing that he has set in train, this liberation that he is now preaching, cannot be contained within that institution, even a reformed version of that institution? It requires a whole new set of institutional arrangements.
There are multiple Rubicons in the way of things.
I mean, presumably it wasn't the 95 Theses.
It's not the 95 Theses. I mean, the Diet of Worms becomes the iconic moment. But for me, the key confrontation comes 2 years earlier than that.
Right. So the Diet of Worms was 1521.
So in the summer of 1519, he's been a public figure for a little less than 2 years. We've had a series of these set-piece confrontations between him and an increasingly senior range of figures from the hierarchy who are trying to bring this situation under control. And most of them have followed the same pattern in which Luther wants to talk about the theology of salvation, and his opponents are effectively saying, we can't talk about that until you have agreed to submit to the authority of the church. And so they just collide and keep talking past one another. Then in the summer of 1519, Luther goes to Leipzig for a disputation with Johann Eck, who I think is probably the most capable theological opponent he ever comes up against. And Eck has spied a way to try to break this logjam. So Luther, up to this point, the appeal that he's been making, the case he's looking to as a way of resolving this, is for there to be a council of the church. That's the traditional way of dealing with a big doctrinal dispute, like Nicaea, Chalcedon, whatever. To appeal to a council over the Pope's head is against canon law. This is one of the things that he's being disciplined for, or that they want to bring him to discipline for. But it's still a recognition of the authority of the church. It's about whether it should be the council or the Pope. When Eck goes to this disputation at Leipzig, he brings along records of the case of Jan Hus. This is the Bohemian heretic who had been burnt just over 100 years earlier. And he demonstrates or puts to Luther a series of Hus's claims, which Luther has affirmed in one form or another, but which were condemned and for which Hus was burnt, and for which Hus was burnt not by order of the Pope or of the Inquisition, but by the order of a council of the Church, of the Council of Constance. So Eck is saying to Luther, all of these propositions that you believe have been condemned in the most authoritative form by exactly the authority to which you are appealing. So you must accept that the Church has spoken in its most solemn way and shown that you are wrong. And Luther is successfully painted into a corner on this one. And he does really the only thing that he can, which is to say, well, if the entire church across the ages with one voice is speaking against him, then the entire church must be wrong, because it's his insight that he has gleaned from Scripture, the direct encounter that he has had with God through his reading of the New Testament. That is the ultimate authority. And he is willing to defy all of the magisterium in whatever form. And once you've done that, the church, in the sense that that word has been understood for most of Christian history, it almost doesn't exist anymore.
And how much of it comes with a threat? Because as I was reading about Luther, a lot of these disputations and encounters we would recognize them as academic. I mean, they happen sometimes in universities. They're facilitated by universities. A lot of university life was public. People would argue these things out in public. And a lot of it is about reading of texts. And some of it is very detailed argument and using history and examples from history. And it's what academics do. And if you are an academic, if you worked in university, you recognize the world that Luther comes from. I certainly do. I mean, it's more public in some ways. It's not the sort of podcast version. These things are happening with an audience looking on, but even that happens with podcasts now. So it's recognizable, and yet the stakes are so high. There's that old joke about academic life. Why is it so vicious? Because the stakes are so low. But in this case, in the background is the fact that Hus was burned. The threat is real, and it's terrifying. And I find, again, it quite hard to wrap my head around how things can be simultaneously recognizably academic in form against a backdrop of, if you either lose the argument or get painted in a corner or say, here I stand and can do no other, you may be tortured to death.
I think we need to recognize that for Luther, certainly for Luther, and indeed for most of his opponents, the stakes are actually much higher than that. This is not about questions of bodily life and death. This is about eternity. The reason that Luther is so fundamentally unwilling to back down, and he discovers a titanic and earth-shaking stubbornness within himself, is because he knows that he holds his soul in his hands on this, and that if he compromises, if he recants, then eternity is at stake here. The devil is an immensely real, immediate figure for Luther, and he is much more afraid of him than he is of anything that the authorities of church and state might do to him. Where he says in the famous lines at the Diet of Worms, when he appeals to his conscience, he says, it is not safe to go against conscience. And that's not a metaphor. The danger that he is in here goes far beyond what the imperial authorities might be able to do to his body.
And so should we therefore conclude that we know how the story goes, which is it didn't cost him his life. He did get protection in the end, though what he did in earthly or worldly terms looks incredibly, almost insanely dangerous. He got away with it. But should we think that none of those calculations entered into it, in the sense that he hadn't positioned himself so that he could think about the possible protections that would come after? Was this really a kind of all or nothing stand? I know I'm asking these questions from a sort of modern perspective, and it's really hard to enter the mindset of someone for whom the devil is more real than being burned at the stake. But, some of it is still recognizably a world in which political calculation is central to the story.
Oh, and he's not indifferent to the question of being burned at the stake, not at all. And there's something a little bit brittle about his courage on some occasions, that he knows he ought to do this, but he also, his sense of himself wavers occasionally. When he goes to the Diet of Worms, he is going under a guarantee of safe conduct, but he knows that Jan Hus was given a guarantee of safe conduct as well, and that canon law says you don't have to keep faith with heretics, on some interpretations of it at least. He goes to Worms very much in the manner of Christ going to Jerusalem. There's something of that quality about his procession. He at least half expects to be martyred. When you look at his correspondence from the weeks and months beforehand, people are warning him not to go, and he is saying, I must, and it's going to be this act of witness. But he's clearly also terrified, as well he might be. And when he's first brought before the Diet, it's remembered as this iconic moment of resistance to all the powers of church and state, this one solitary figure. And it is that. But when he's first asked, will you recant, he says, well, can I have 24 hours to think about it? And we've got one letter that he writes during that night, which, again, sounds a little bit brittle, as if he's, you would, wouldn't you? And, eventually he's brought back the following day, and it takes him a little while to get to the famous statement. He has to work himself up to it, but he does. So that sense of fear is there, and yet martyrdom also has its attraction to him. Later in life, he's going to have a proper full-on spiritual crisis when he is realizing that others are dying for the faith that he's preached, and yet he is growing old in safety. And he wonders, does this mean that God has rejected me? Because we know that God disciplines those whom he loves. That New Testament sense that martyrdom is the true calling of a Christian, and yet it seems to have been denied to him. So suffering is, of course, an evil, and in some ways he's one of the great Christian theologians of the body and of earthly happiness. And yet he's also a theologian of the cross, as he would see it. Another of those paradoxes, in which suffering is an evil, and yet it is the ultimate calling of the Christian. If it was good enough for Christ, then it's good enough for him.
And he did endure quite a lot of bodily suffering of a more routine kind, didn't he? He's one of those people who is known for having, I mean, maybe everyone in this period, we never know, maybe everyone was in pain all the time because there was no pain relief. And also he was a little hypochondriac too, but he seems like someone who spent quite a lot of time thinking about how his body was letting him down.
I at least want to believe that not everybody in the 16th century was as constipated as he was. I mean, clearly, especially in later life, he's not a well man, and he writes about it at stomach-churning length. He's this very open, intimate figure.
And that's why he speaks across the ages. On the question of the political protection, so he went to Worms under a kind of guarantee of safety, but as you say, this is not an age where you want to rely too much on those. But it does cash out. And various significant people, princes in Germany and others, protect him for the rest of his life. What was in it for them and what price did they extract for it? So if we move now to the politics of this and how this becomes what we now call the Reformation, it's a political story as much as it's a theological story. For them, what's the point at which they are willing to cross that line and defend this man after he's been excommunicated?
I think there's two parts to that question, but both of them are quite revealing. So to begin with, for the first 3, 4, 5 years of his public career, this is the point at which he should have been arrested. The whole normal machinery of heresy control, the Inquisition, should have swung into play, and this should all have been closed down. The church has well-developed and practiced mechanisms for dealing with this sort of thing. And in some ways, the fact that that doesn't happen looks like a political coincidence. The fact that his local prince happens at that point because he's one of those who has the responsibility for electing the Holy Roman Emperor. The Holy Roman Emperor is on the point of dying. Nobody wants to offend him at that stage, and so they decide not to mess with somebody from his university that prince himself had founded. But I think that slightly misses the point, which is why is Elector Frederick, the Elector of Saxony, who doesn't seem to have had any great doctrinal sympathy for Luther's preaching. In fact, given that Elector Frederick was very proud of his collection of relics, Luther's preaching is not, really conducive to his view of the world. The two men never seem to have met in person. But what Luther has done is put this new University of Wittenberg on the map. So I think ultimately what saves him at the beginning is not so much the prince's personal sympathy for him as his own celebrity. It's the way that he has been able to turn himself into a public figure. The scale of his literary achievement, both in quantity of output, the numbers of editions being sold, is just breathtaking. He dominates the movement and the print market of Germany in those few years in the late 1510s, early 1520s. I think in a way that no revolutionary leader has ever dominated their movement. There's a famous assessment looking at all the different editions of pamphlets that are published during those crucial 7-8 years, in which Luther is responsible for around 20% of the entire pamphlet output of Germany during that period, 1,500 editions or so. If you add up all the editions of works published in support of him, there's only about 800. So, he is everywhere. Whereas the people trying to write against him, there's 200-300 of those, and the printers are complaining that they can't sell the copies. So he has become this extraordinarily viral public figure, and that is his shield, at least to begin with. There's then a second phase. Once this has become a little bit more serious, once he's been formally condemned, you then have a few years of shadow boxing in which the emperor, the young Emperor Charles V, it seems to be his decision to let him go after Worms. A young man, honorable, maybe a little bit naive. He decides to stick to his word. And he's got his hands very full. He's got wars with the Ottomans, with the French. Dealing with a heretic in Saxony is not his top priority. And so it's a few years before he's able really to give some proper attention to that in the late 20s. And by this stage, Luther has begun to think seriously about the terms of an alliance. with the princes who might be willing to support him, of whom there are a handful, but enough. So the Elector of Saxony, the Landgrave of Hesse, who becomes an important figure in this, a series of others. And the deal that he offers to these people is to say, because I don't believe in the authority of the church as a political institution, all of that authority which they've traditionally wielded should in fact be held by you as God's anointed princes. All you need to do is to permit and to encourage evangelical preaching. And of course, it just so happens that running a church on Luther's principles is a much more lightweight institution than the complex piety and structures of the old church. And so, what are they going to do with all that property? So the possibility of this deal whereby the new Lutheran churches that begin to emerge from the mid-1520s onwards, that you start to see them taking institutional shape, will receive protection and patronage from these princes in return for granting them a degree of sovereignty over law and over property within their own territories that they have not enjoyed. So that ongoing battles between church and state, the dance between church and state that's been going on for the last 500 years in the medieval West, takes a decisive turn here, that Luther is able to offer these princes something new. And for many of them, certainly for those initial supporters, I think we do have to recognize that their conviction of the power of Luther's message is authentic. Somebody like Philip of Hesse and others, Philip of Hesse is present at the Diet of Worms and is clearly moved by what he sees. So I don't think we should necessarily see these folks as cynical. Some of them plainly are. Gustav Vasa, the King of Sweden, absolutely regards this as an opportunity for a full takeover of the Swedish church and seizure of its property. He seems to have very little interest in theology. And then you have a figure like Henry VIII, who has an intense, although intermittent, interest in theology, a very peculiar collection of ideas, but absolutely becomes convinced, due to a reading of some Lutheran inflected ideas, that God has appointed him, Henry Tudor, as the supreme head of the Church of England under Christ. He has to admit that bit. But the extent to which that allows him to seize a degree of authority that none of his predecessors had is what's most appealing about it.
And convenient as well. But in Germany, these are princes. So to what extent did that deal also depend on Luther having shown his bona fides as not at all wanting to encourage the more small p popular possible manifestations of this movement? So he's a popular writer in an age of mass illiteracy, but there's another way these ideas are being communicated, not just through the printing press, but through the pulpit and through the spread, just through the word, right? The spread of the word. And there is a really radical way this can go, and it did go briefly, not this itself, but there was notoriously a peasants' revolt. To what extent did the deal depend on Luther showing them that that's not a tool where he thought this should go?
This is the way that the whole movement nearly collapses or blows itself up. There's a moment in the early 20s when it almost seems as if this might sweep everything before it. As if, Luther absolutely has his enemies on the back foot. You can imagine at that stage, he and some of his supporters do imagine that a true Reformation might take place, that the whole Western Church might be renewed along the sorts of principles that he has preached. And you don't have to have his ultimate views about what the authority of the church should be. There are very sensible, high-ranking, quite institutionally conservative, mainstream folks within Rome who are thinking there are important ideas here. We need to take some of this on board. Something could be done. But the nature of his appeal to conscience and the tremendous theatre of his defiance of the authority of the church has set loose a range of emotions which are beyond his control. And this is something that is apparent almost from the beginning, that once he's made this appeal to conscience, Others are following him in doing so. Indeed, some of them are claiming, in some cases it might even be true, that they had started doing this before he did. It's not as if everybody had been sleeping until suddenly Luther pitched up and didn't nail something to a door. So this series of movements in different contexts are erupting everywhere. And the specific variant that emerges in the Swiss Confederation we'll come back to. But the radicalism that begins to not only think we need to implement this in terms of reform of the church much more aggressively than Luther might want to, but to carry it through to social and political implications. This is there from the beginning. You can see it in 1520, 1521, people beginning to preach this sort of thing, and then shortly afterwards to put it into practice in local areas. And you don't need to twist Luther's ideas much at all to get to this point. So if you're taking scripture as your authority, well, it tells us that the early Christians held all their goods in common. So why shouldn't we do that? Or the book of Deuteronomy tells us that idolaters should die the death. So what should we do with all these priests who've been worshipping a piece of bread as if it were God? And at the least, should congregations be electing their own priests? And Luther very quickly discovers that he is a spiritual revolutionary, but not a political revolutionary. He's genuinely socially conservative and is horrified by all this stuff. And that's not just because he is by instinct a deeply conservative character in a surprising number of ways, but also because he regards all of this as a theological category error. What these folks are doing, he thinks, is the same as what Erasmus is doing. They're trying to replace a bad set of laws with a better set of laws. And he's saying, no, that utterly misunderstands the radicalism of what he's understood the gospel is, which is that it transcends the category of law altogether, that this is moving out of a realm of regulation and compulsion into a realm of love. And yet, because he's not then trying to create some sort of utopian commune, he recognizes that human nature remains mired in sin, continues to be enslaved to corruption. And so this is where he gets his famous doctrine of the two kingdoms, that you have the kingdom of Christ, which is the coming realm, which is governed entirely by love, governed by the gospel, in which people no more need law to tell them what to do than an apple tree needs laws to tell it how to grow. And yet, as long as we live in this world, we are also sinners and need to be subject to the law, to discipline, to structure. And so if you're living in a world of injustice, as he accepts he is, he's extraordinarily rude about these princes and the nature of their rule. He said the response to that should not be to try to reform them, to try to make this world better, but it should be to repent, because if God has given you wicked rulers, he is punishing you. And the response to that should be repentance rather than rebellion. And instead to look ahead to the kingdom of Christ, which is the only truly perfect kingdom. And yet around him, there are all these other preachers who are saying, well, no, actually, we think that the kingdom of Christ could be brought to life here. And it is at least implicated in, it's one of the accelerants to this rebellion, this wave of rebellions, series of uprisings that sweep across Central Europe in 1524-25 that we call the Peasants' War, which looks to be the largest mass rebellion in the whole of European history before the French Revolution. It's an event of cataclysmic scale. And I mean, to be fair to him, Luther is at least torn. If you read his pamphlets written early on, as it becomes clear the scale of what's going on, he is appealing to the peasants to return home and to try to deal with their legitimate concerns by petitioning and by prayer, rather than by taking up arms. Is it willfully naive? I think it's culpably naive in any case. And once it becomes clear that this isn't happening, that the peasants are not humbly dealing with their problems on their knees, all of his social conservatism kicks in. And his pamphlet against the robbing and murdering hordes of peasants gives you an idea of where we're going. He compares them to mad dogs that have to be killed. I don't think that means he's responsible for the violent suppression of the rebellion, for the 100,000 plus who are killed. That would have happened anyway. I think it does mean he has to bear some moral culpability for it, but it also means he's perfectly positioned to present himself as the acceptable face of reform once this is all over, and is able to say to the princes, there is a choice between anarchy and returning back to the embrace of the old church. And that's what he gives them. I think we need to recognize how grievous a defeat this is for him, that the eventual solution that's reached of partition, of some territories embracing his message while the majority remain loyal to Rome, this was not the Reformation which he had been trying to preach. And the way that that partition then becomes entrenched and the basis for warfare over the next century and more is a very long way from what he'd hoped for. But it's the solution which the nature of the politics he ends up preaching. In retrospect, it looks inevitable that it should have led there.
And how did he think the boundaries of that world, once he had accepted it, should be policed, so that we're somewhere between anarchy and the old church, but also this is then a world in which that space starts to split, and there are schisms and fights and all the rest, some political, some theological, and there is then going to be a question, does the Lutheran set of churches that are emerging defend itself tooth and nail against these things? How tolerant can it be within that broader space? Anarchy is out, a return to Rome is out, but that still leaves a lot of space that either has to be allowed to develop in its own way or to be policed. How did he think it should be policed?
Well, this is where you see Luther kind of backpedaling furiously. When you read his writings from the early 1520s, his most famous political treatise, which is called On Temporal Authority, to what extent it should be obeyed. So he's writing from the point of view of the subject, considering what level of resistance is legitimate and what kinds of authority the temporal government can wield. And there he's very clear that there should be no censorship, there should be no control of conscience, that it's entirely illegitimate for the temporal government to police heresy or to punish heresy, that the only weapons that should be used against heresy are the weapons of the kingdom of Christ, in other words, preaching. And these are some of the passages which, if you quote them on their own, it makes him look like a 19th century liberal.
But he wasn't.
Which, that's not his fault. And once he finds himself in a position of power, or in a position at least of advising power, the only job he ever has is professor of theology at Wittenberg University. He always maintains that arm's length from political authority. His willingness to reprimand his political allies is always there, but it's limited. He's aware of the price of the deal that he's made, and he's also genuinely concerned about maintaining order within these new churches. So he always holds on to the view that heresy should not be punished, that it's not a matter for the law. But he does argue that blasphemy can be punished by the secular law. And he has a complex and, frankly, not very serious rationale for why this should be the case. And his view of the nature of the authority that princes can wield develops, let's say. And partly under pressure from events and partly under pressure from princes themselves, who are very keen to expand this sort of authority. To some extent, from a genuine sense of responsibility. They feel that they have been given by God, like Henry VIII has, authority over their territories, and so serving as the protectors of the church is clearly part of their roles. Who could object to that? And if you're protecting the church, well, then maybe you're also the patron of it, and you're providing it with buildings and all these things and helping to regulate its structures. Luther has no interest in structures and laws and so forth, genuinely bored by the subject, and is willing to let all of those kind of institutional reforms be pushed through as local princes think. And so they move from being a separate kingdom, which has nothing to do with the kingdom of Christ, to being its patrons, its supporters, its protectors, with a degree of authority, which, well, it's not the only way that it's possible to play this out in a Protestant system.
And we're going to talk about another way that might be played out in the next episode that we're going to do. I've got two more questions. They're very different kinds of questions. Why was he such a virulent anti-Semite? Because he really was, even by the standards of the age.
Oh, I mean, he writes two principal books on Jews and Judaism, and the second one of those, on the Jews and their lies, is it absolutely stands out in the era. I mean, I think the best you can say for it is that he doesn't openly call for genocide. He goes sort of up to that line and looks over it. I think it does need to understand how he gets there, you need to read it through the first book, 20 years earlier, which is called That Jesus Christ Was Born a Jew, which ostensibly is a book about the status of Jews and Judaism. It's actually not really about Jews at all. It's about Catholics. It's pursuing his ongoing feud with the old church by other means. And his argument in that is the reason that the Jews have not converted to Christianity is because of the way the Catholics have treated them. The corruption of the old church and the abuse that they've suffered are the things that they've quite rightly rejected the first, and they've entirely understandably been unconverted by the second. So it fits with his opposition to religious coercion. And therefore, one of the ways that we, our Reformed Church, will demonstrate the truth of the gospel that we're preaching is that we will stop doing these things, we'll reform all these practices that Jews so dislike, and then they'll all convert. And that will be one of the great demonstrations of the truth and the power of our gospel. And of course, that doesn't happen. And so one of the things that's going on in On the Jews and Their Lies is a sense of virulent bitterness that we did everything that you could have asked for. We gave you every possible chance, and still you haven't converted. And so all of the tropes about Jews as stubborn, as stiff-necked, as they always say. We have showed you the truth, we have rubbed your noses in it, and still you persist in this baffling insistence on being yourselves, which is something that Christians had. It's a way that Christians have responded to Judaism for centuries, but he is doubling down on it. So that's one side of it. But I think what makes that traditional response of bafflement and frustration at Judaism's sort of infuriating insistence on continuing to be there, what makes that particularly virulent for him is that there's that sort of classic anti-Semitism matched with a new theological anti-Judaism. That for him, and this partly becomes from his reading of Paul, Judaism has become the icon of theological error for him. There's contrast between the law and the gospel, between good works and faith. Judaism serves as the symbol of a ceremonialist, a self-righteous, a works-righteous system. And I mean, much of this is picking up on language that Paul uses, but then Paul is talking about his own background and tradition, and it plays rather differently from how it does in 16th century Germany. So I think those two different strands come together in this. Though I think it's fair to say that Luther, I mean, you say he's exceptional in his time. He's exceptional amongst Lutherans. Most of his allies and contemporaries regard this lurch towards crazy levels of violence and prejudice in the last years of his life as a little unbecoming and beneath his dignity. And people are, some of them, trying to soft pedal this or get him to push back on it. So Luther is distinct from the rest of his movement in many, many ways. In the way of so many founders of movements, Luther's not a Lutheran. And his anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, well, the way that he combines the two is not something that many other Protestants are going to pick up on. But, of course, it remains there in the record to be used whenever anybody chooses to use it. And the way that he becomes associated with German nationalism means it's just sitting there as a gift for the Nazis.
So that leads to my last question. There are a million ways we could talk about how this story goes, and we just can't, right? So I'm going to ask one which just leaps across 4 centuries, but it connects to what you just said there. So Martin Luther King Jr. was not born Martin Luther King, and he became Martin Luther King Jr. because his father adopted the name Martin Luther after a visit to Germany, I think in 1934, so under the Nazis, when he was inspired by what he saw of the Lutheran churches. But this is also a time where the Nazis are using Luther's anti-Semitism as part of their propaganda. So I don't know enough about that story to know what actually happened with Martin Luther King Sr. But is there a line? I mean, is it possible? This is a huge and slightly ridiculous question, but is it possible to think of a line in the history of ideas that does run from Martin Luther to Martin Luther King Jr., or is that just a coincidence of naming? When we think about these as revolutionary ideas?
Is there a line? No, but I think there's a wave. There's a set of ideas that ripple out from what Martin Luther had done and said, many of which go in unintended and unforeseen directions. Some go in directions that had been foreseen but not intended. The matching of names makes the connection between the two Martin Luthers 4 centuries apart particularly compelling. And you can see some of those principles that resurface in Martin Luther King, and you can trace the line by which they got there through English Puritanism and then the ways that Protestant Christianity develops in the American context, both black and white, the emergence of the Baptist movement out of which Luther comes. And there is a regular return in these movements to Luther himself and to some of, especially of his devotional writings, the emphasis on liberation and on spiritual liberty that he speaks of. So that's there. But the reason I would say it's a wave rather than a line is that is only one of many, many connections that could be pulled out. I think it's the nature of the Protestant movements in all of their plurality that arise out of Luther's original protest, that they're usually at each other's throats. And in most of the great ideological confrontations of modernity, from the confrontations over slavery through to Nazism and fascism, through to civil rights and whatever else, you will find people who are authentically descendants of that tradition on both sides. I think most of what's happened in the 5 centuries of Christian and post-Christian cultures since can be framed as civil wars within the Lutheran tradition.
And you mentioned 2 words there, Puritans and Baptists. We haven't talked about Luther on baptism. It's a very important question, but we are going to talk about that next time when we talk about Calvin. There is a second part to my conversation with Alec Ryrie, and we will be putting it out tomorrow as a bonus episode on PPF+. To hear it, you'll need to subscribe. Just go to our website, ppfideas.com, or click on the link in our show description. It is a conversation about the other most consequential figure in the history of the European Reformation, and perhaps someone who is even more revolutionary, John Calvin. We're talking about Calvin and Calvinism. It's a conversation that goes all the way from 16th century Geneva to 20th century apartheid South Africa. Calvinism really did change the world. Listen to that episode to find out how. We've told you about the 2 live events that we will be doing for PPF in March. If you would like to come to Network at the Regent Street Cinema in London on the 18th of March, there are just a handful of tickets left at the time of recording, so you will need to book quickly. The link is on our website, ppfideas.com. There are also still tickets available for my conversation at the Bath Curious Minds Festival with Robert Saunders about the legacy of Winston Churchill. That event is on the 29th of March. Come and hear us record it live. Again, the link is on our website. Next time, in our regular slot on the history of revolutionary ideas, we are going to be talking to the historian of science, Simon Schaffer, about what some people think is the biggest revolution of them all, the scientific revolution. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books. Past, Present, Future is part of the Airwave podcast network.